So I had originally intended to do this as an online conference in Zoom or Google Meet or equivalent, but I worked through the details and there were scheduling issues, and I decided to just do a video presentation, upload it to YouTube, and post the link so that I could show you the things that are in front of me right now. And we can then discuss them in the various discussion venues because not everybody is in the same place. So OHM Tagging Challenges. We talk a lot about tagging. We've done a bunch of work, but there have always been kind of issues that were open to discussion. So really there are three criteria that I think I want to break out here. First of all, whatever schemes we use in OHM need to be editable with minimal or no change to ID and JOSM. And this is basically a criteria that's being realistic, that OHM is a niche user of these packages. And unless we roll out our own JOSM plugin, we really need to live with the package in front of us. The next criteria is that we need to be able to represent the real world mapping use cases we're encountering. I mean, it's all well and good to talk about how we might do things, but the kind of data that we're working with really is going to be telling us what we need to do. And then the final criteria is that it needs to be usable by data consumers without excessive pain. And this is sometimes an issue in OpenStreetMap, is that people get so focused on, well, what are creative ways of tagging things, that they don't think about what's going to happen on the back end when somebody tries to actually do something with the data. So let's take a look at this. The mapping context that's most interesting is when we're working in temporarily deep models of areas, which, most likely we're going to see this with European cities, which tend to be very old, and with some East Coast U.S. cities that have some age. I'm working in Albany, New York, which is about as old as a city in the U.S. gets. So I'm talking about 400 years. And now Europe goes back way longer, but 400 years is long enough for things to get really complicated and confusing. There are really two data consumers of interest right now. There is the OHM vector tile rendering engine with the new time slider feature, and there are overpass queries by apps. And typically an app will expect a well-structured, easily traversable response in XML or in GeoJSON. Now the existing approaches. The first one I'm going to call old OSM. It's an OSM proposal, never adapted, that was active 2014 to 2017 and appears to be, well, I guess not dead, but undead. It's there, but it's getting referenced, but it's not really ever making any progress towards an adapted proposal. And what this involved was basically setting up key colon and then a date range. Now, I'm one of the people coming out of a database community who doesn't really see a rationale behind putting data in the key space. I mean, it's key equals value for a reason. And that just always struck me as being really perverse, trying to stick your data on that side. It can really complicate the life of a data consumer because now you pretty much got to parse all the keys in a data return in order to see if there are date ranges there and what they are. And then the final limitation is the proposal only supports ISO format dates. Is much narrower than the range of dates that are in theory supported by the start date, end date format. So not only does it complicate life, but it doesn't really even seem to cover all of the cases that we can in theory deal with. Second one I'll refer to as OHM 1. And in this one, we duplicate the ways reusing nodes, so we have typically multiple ways sharing geometry, and this allows us to tag start and end dates and varying key values on ways. So for example, if a highway changes its classification from unclassified up to tertiary, or if it's converted from a track into an actual unclassified highway, we can represent that It lets us represent name changes on roads in a way that doesn't involve sticking those wacky dates in the key. Existing data consumers don't necessarily need changes. In fact, this probably will just work in Time Slider without anything necessarily being done. However, it could be kind of hard to work with in current editors, although there are some tactics for dealing with this in JOSM, which I will show in a demo just as we get a little further along here. So it's not an absolutely unworkable solution. It just requires being smart in how you use the editor. The other option is I'll call OSM2. You don't duplicate the ways, but you use relations to carry start and end dates and varying key information. That means that data consumers need to be relation aware. But then handling relations and overpass is not so bad. JOSM has good relation support. I'm not really an ID user, so I can't speak to what ID will do. And this is a way that also is probably kind of workable. And this was the way I favored, although I've run into things that have caused me to change my view a little bit. So we're going to look at two examples here of different things, fairly different things in OSM that will teach us something about what works and what doesn't. So the practical examples where the rubber meets the road and we're looking at things we're actually doing as opposed to things maybe that we wish we were doing. First example is Thompson Speedway. This is part of my Ghost Tracks project, and I've been doing things in this manner in Ghost Tracks for years, and it has been working well. And let's switch to the correct window here and go to Thompson Speedway. And this is my leaflet widget, which does a hybridization thing of overpass queries from OpenStreetMap and OpenHistoricalMap. And so we have a OpenStreetMap base map here, and then we have various layers in leaflet which allow us to see the variations in the road course at Thompson Speedway over the years. So what we have done in OpenHistoricalMap and OpenStreetMap is that we have used the highway equals raceway tagging for the ways, and then for each circuit that has been used over the years, we just set up a relation with start dates and end dates in OHM and start dates in OpenStreetMap, because in theory everything in OSM is current. The overpass query on the relations works perfectly well, and everything really is just fine. And you can see in pink the rendering of the current OpenStreetMap version of the track. Now the big motivation behind using relations and ways in this manner is that as they reconfigured the racetrack over the years, parts of the track and what parts of the track were being used would get shifted, so there would be periods when pavement wasn't in use, and then it would get put back in use as time changed. So using relations and ways in this manner is pretty economical and pretty easy to do. Like I say, I've been doing it for years. But the time slider right now is not really relation aware in terms of start and end dates. And this is what it looks like in the time slider at Thompson right now. I haven't gone and really looked at the data in JOSM, but I believe I have a pit lane as a start and end date on it, which is why we see that actually show up. But none of the rest of it does because of start and end dates are on the relation. Okay, yeah, as we zoom in more, we see, interestingly enough, that pit lane, the text appears, but there is no rendering. And that's, again, I have got to go look at the data to see if I can get an idea of why that is. But that's basically where things are with Thompson. Now let's go back and talk about our other example. And this is an example of one of those historically deep periods. Albany, New York from 1800 to present, and we're going to focus on a specific small area in Albany, the western terminus of the legendary Erie Canal and the surrounding streets. And this got me to where I'm looking at very small things where using relations to bundle things together isn't an ideal solution. So let's go back to, okay, here we are looking at Albany. Okay, there we go. 1819 is before the Erie Canal is built. And we haven't really got all the street network for the period done yet, but we have a number in there that are rendering. We're a little weak on start-finish dates for the street grid right now. The Erie Canal is not built yet in 1819, so we're going to move the time slider. Now we're at 1825. So what has happened here? Well, the Albany Basin has been constructed. This is parallel to the Hudson River, which is not rendering right now. The Hudson River runs from middle bottom up diagonally a little bit to the right. And we see the Albany Basin, which was a docking space, cargo transfer space that was dug out for the canal. And then we see the lock on the canal, the so-called Little Basin, and then the canal heading off roughly parallel to the river. And of course, being a canal, it's got a towpath, and that shows up right there. And time slider is really working pretty well on this example. So we advance the time slider, and I know what's going to happen next, because there's a project that was executed to enlarge the Erie Canal because it became overcapacity within 10 years of being built. So we see that they've enlarged the so-called Little Basin, they've moved the locks, they've altered the canal close to the basin. I've added a lot of docking spaces there, and you know, this is really pretty cool. This is why the time slider was something we really wanted. Now I will point out one issue here. I actually built Erie Canal relations for both the original canal and the enlarged canal. But just as with Thompson, time slider right now isn't really relation aware when it comes to start and end dates. So I ended up putting start and end dates on all of the actual ways in order to get this to render the way I wanted it to. If we were to make relations data aware the way I think that they should be, so my Thompson examples work right in time slider, this should work right too. So now we're going to continue the time slider. And this is basically because I want to show, there we go. There are the two railroad bridges that got built right after the Civil War. And then in 1904, thereabouts, things change. The Erie Canal is retired in favor of the New York State Barge Canal, which is starts out in a very different place. The north end of the Albany Basin is filled in because nobody really likes the Albany Basin. And this bridge shortened because, it no longer was over water because the Albany Basin had been partially filled in. So we see there's a bunch of change through here. And now what I want to do is go over to JOSM where I am looking at this data. And this should be pretty reminiscent to anybody who watches Doctor Who of that one episode a few years ago where all of history was happening all at once. And before I learned about JOSM filters, I was concerned simply about whether or not it was practical to edit these sorts of things. But I have JOSM filters enabled right now. So, for example, I can turn on this filter start date before 1839. And now I see the original Albany Basin, and I see the original canal. Turn that off. I'm going to get both canals and turn both filters on, and then invert the sense of the earlier start date filter. So you see I have considerable ability to thin things out and focus on what's immediately important. So that's really cool, and that's a really useful capability. And I think that that's what really makes editing in JOSM very practical. But what I want to do is look at some of the data. One of the things that is the case here is that I have built the canal using two map sources that show the canal when it was current. The road network I have right now is mostly off of a 1952 aerial image, and so the thing is that not fully compatible right now. In particular, that road right there is a road you will find scattered around. And what that is Erie Boulevard, because when Erie Canal was filled in many locales, they made it into a road and named it Erie Boulevard. And if you do a search in Overpass for that all across New York State, you're going to find a lot of them. And so we see, for example, that a piece of North Lawrence Street is actually on top of the canal. That's easily resolvable with start and end dates, so we really don't care much about that and use filters like I said. But let's look at this a little more closely. This is the 1834 Erie Canal Survey map that I used for the original canal and the original version of the Little Basin. So we have a chunk of North Lawrence Street, and it's actually longer in this period, so it's not a big deal to add another piece of North Lawrence Street. And I haven't verified it, but I believe the piece of North Lawrence Street on this end is actually probably named North Lawrence Street, although I'm not 100% sure if the name was reused. And that's 1834. And so we're looking at this version of the Erie Canal. We have a small footbridge across the end of it. 1892 is where I got the enlarged canal from. And now this is where really the killer comes in, is that North Lawrence Street, or Lawrence Street in this map, is continuous. It has a real road bridge over the end of the canal. The bridge is in a different place from the footbridge, and not only that, but the bridge overlaps something that's not bridge after the canal is removed entirely. And I don't think that there's a practical way to deal with this using relations. And I have a feeling that stuff like this is going to tend to come up. It's right in front of me right now. And so the answer I have iterated towards is that we actually need to use both the OHM1 and the OHM2 editing approaches. That for these kinds of micro mapping challenges, we need to use just duplicate ways, much as it hurts to do something like that. And for the larger things, we can focus on using relations in pretty much the OSM way. And part of the reason why I ended up doing this video and not holding that phone, well, not phone, but that online meeting in whatever venue we were going to hold it, is simply because I actually did come to this conclusion and I wanted to make my case. And so that's pretty much what I've iterated towards, and I think I've shown you why we ought to do it that way. And I will be posting this later today, and we can talk about it.